The room smelled of antiseptic and the particular stillness that settles around hospital beds at the end of things. It was a Wednesday in March of 2024, and Dennis Hargrove was 68 years old and dying of pancreatic cancer. His daughter, Melissa, had driven 3 hours from Portland to sit with him. She had been there for 2 days. In those 2 days, he had been mostly quiet, drifting in and out, holding her hand, saying very little that needed to be said. And then he said it. "I buried the truth," he told her. "All those years. I buried the truth about that girl." Melissa didn't understand at first. Then she did. Then she sat very still for a very long time. She drove home. She did not sleep. She called the Maine State Police the following morning. What Melissa reported that morning reopened a case that had been frozen in the files of Knox County for exactly 40 years. A case involving a 19-year-old girl who had walked out of a diner in Rockport, Maine, on the last Friday night of October 1984, and had never been seen again. Before we get to what Melissa told police and what they found when they went looking, we have to go back to Rockport, Maine, in the fall of 1984. Because to understand the weight of what was confessed in that hospital room, you have to understand who Carol Ann Perkins was. Rockport in 1984 was the kind of small Maine coastal town that the rest of the country likes to imagine when it thinks of Maine. Lobster boats rocking in the harbor at first light, wooden storefronts along the main street, the smell of salt air and spruce trees hitting you the moment you stepped outside in the morning. The summer people came and went, and the locals remained, and the locals understood themselves to be the ones who kept the place real. By October, the leaf peepers had gone home, and the harbor had thinned out, and Rockport became itself again. Quiet, weathered, tight-knit, and loyal in the particular way of people who have survived a lot of cold winters together. Carol Ann Perkins had grown up in that town the way you grow up when your father is a lobsterman, knowing the sound of a marine engine starting before dawn, reading weather by the way light changed over Penobscot Bay, understanding that the work was never quite done and that the family depended on all of it. Her father, Raymond, had been running traps out of Rockport Harbor for 22 years. Her mother had passed when Carol was 13, and without discussion or ceremony, Carol had quietly become the steady center of what remained of the family, keeping track of her 2 younger brothers, making sure there was a hot meal when Raymond came in from the water, working weekends to help cover what the boats didn't. She was 19 years old. She had been waitressing at Pendleton's Diner on Commercial Street for 3 years, long enough to know every regular by name and order, long enough to have saved enough for a semester of classes at the community college in Rockland, where she was studying basic accounting. She had a plan: learn enough to run the books for small businesses in town, enough to stay in Rockport and still make something of herself. She did not want to leave. She wanted to build something here. On the corkboard above her dresser, she had pinned a piece of notebook paper with a handwritten list. Her brother Kevin, who still has that piece of paper, later read several items to investigators: see the fall colors in Vermont, learn to make Mom's blueberry pie the right way, read every book on Dad's shelf, save enough to buy Raymond a new truck. She had not checked off a single item yet. On the last Friday of October 1984, Carol finished her shift at Pendleton's, wrapped the leftover blueberry pie in wax paper to bring home, and walked out into the cold night air for the last time. The woman who ran the diner, a widow named Eleanor Pendleton, was the last person to speak to Carol that night. She told police that Carol had seemed perfectly normal, tired after a long Friday double, but in good spirits. A regular customer named Dennis Hargrove had been in earlier that evening and had stayed until closing, as he always did on Fridays. He was the owner of a hardware store 2 blocks up the street. He came in for the pie. Eleanor walked Carol to the front door. Carol turned left on Commercial Street toward the parking lot on Elm, where she'd left her car. Eleanor locked the door and went back to the register. At 10:42 p.m., a couple walking a dog on Elm Street noticed Carol's blue 1979 Chevette still in the parking lot. Engine off, driver's side door standing open. They assumed someone had stepped out briefly. They walked on. By 11:30, the car was still there. By 7:00 the following morning, it had not moved. Raymond Perkins was at the state police barracks by 8 loco. He told the duty officer that his daughter had never once failed to come home without calling first. Not once. The duty officer wrote it down. Maine State Police opened a missing person investigation that Saturday morning. The parking lot was processed by noon. Carol's purse was found behind the rear tire of her own car, as though it had been dropped and kicked aside. Inside, her wallet, her house keys, the wax paper-wrapped slice of blueberry pie. The Chevette's engine was cold. She had never started it. Investigators canvassed Commercial Street and the surrounding blocks. They spoke to 23 residents in the first 2 days. A teenage boy walking home reported seeing a dark pickup truck idling near the Elm Street lot around 10:30. He couldn't recall the make or the plate. He thought it might have been dark blue. He wasn't certain of even that. A search of the woods and shoreline was organized the following weekend. More than 200 volunteers spread across the birch and spruce in lines, calling her name. They found nothing. Within 6 weeks, the investigation had reached its first hard wall. No body. No confirmed witness. A parking lot. A purse. A slice of pie. And a father who was spending every evening after his boat came in, walking the tree lines north of town with a flashlight, calling into the dark. Carol Ann Perkins was not found that winter. She was not found the following spring. The investigator assigned to Carol's case was Detective Frank Ogilvy of the Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit, a compact, careful man from Bangor who had spent 15 years on violent crimes and who approached every case with what his colleagues described as deliberate patience. He was the kind of detective who read case files 3 times before making a call, who never wrote a suspect's name in permanent ink until he had something solid to write it in. Ogilvy worked through 7 persons of interest in the first 3 months. A former boyfriend who had moved to Bangor, interviewed. Alibi confirmed through work records. A transient reported acting erratically near the harbor that fall, located in Portland, eliminated. A married man whose interest in Carol had made Eleanor Pendleton uncomfortable, interviewed, account corroborated by multiple witnesses. And Dennis Hargrove. Hargrove was 28 years old in 1984, recently married, well established in the community, running the hardware store his father had built on the same block for 30 years. He coached youth hockey at the rink on Park Street. 2 of Carol's co-workers had mentioned independently that Hargrove always seemed to linger near Carol's tables and stay until the end of her shift. Ogilvy brought him in for a voluntary interview in December. Hargrove was steady. Cooperative, he confirmed he'd been at the diner until closing, paid his check, and driven straight home. His wife, Janet, confirmed he was home by 10:30. There were no inconsistencies, no hesitations. Ogilvy noted in his report that Hargrove presented as forthcoming and offered detail without prompting, and that there was nothing in his presentation to indicate deception. The interview was logged. The name stayed on the list, but the list led nowhere. Meanwhile, Raymond Perkins had his own investigation. He kept a notebook. He wrote down the name of every person who had spoken to Carol in her final weeks, every vehicle seen near the diner that fall, every piece of information his lobsterman's network could surface. He showed the notebook to Ogilvy twice. Both times, Ogilvy read every page carefully, thanked him, and promised to follow up on anything he could use. Nothing in the notebook ever became actionable. Ogilvy transferred to a different unit in 1988, but kept Carol's file in a cardboard box in his home office closet. He reviewed it every year at Christmas, a habit his wife learned not to question. He retired in 2003 without having closed it. The box went with him. By 1994, 10 years had passed. Rockport had grown a little, lost a little, stayed mostly itself. Pendleton's diner had been sold twice. The second owner kept Eleanor's photograph of the original staff on the wall near the register, and someone had placed a small laminated photo of Carol beside it. Nobody took it down when the ownership changed again. Carol's brother Kevin was working as a mechanic in Camden by the time he was 30. He told a reporter from the Courier-Gazette in 1999 that he thought about Carol every day. Not in a dramatic way, he said. Just the way you think about someone who was supposed to be there. By 2004, the case had been reviewed 3 times by successive cold case coordinators at the Maine State Police. Each review reached the same conclusion: the evidence was insufficient. A DNA sample recovered from the door handle of Carol's Chevette had been submitted to Cody's in 2001 after a brief reinvestigation. No match returned. Dennis Hargrove had expanded the hardware store in 1991, opened a second location in Camden in 1998, and sold both in 2009 when he retired. He and Janet had 2 daughters. He had 6 grandchildren. He served on the Rockport Select Board for 8 years. He was the kind of man who showed up to every community meeting and stayed until the last item on the agenda. Raymond Perkins named his second lobster boat Carol Ann and launched it in the spring of 1987. He took it out every season until his knees gave out. Every time he came into the harbor in the failing afternoon light, he looked at the hills above the granite quarry north of town with the expression of a man who cannot name what he feels. He died in 2019. He died not knowing. By then, the reward poster Raymond had printed in November of 1984 and nailed to every telephone pole on Commercial Street had been gone for years. But the laminated photo beside Eleanor's staff portrait at the diner was still there. Still on the wall. And there was one person at the Maine State Police who had been actively carrying Carol's file for 4 years by then. Detective Sarah Moody, who had grown up in Camden, 15 minutes from Rockport, and who had been 12 years old when her own mother pointed at the newspaper and said quietly, "That girl was only 7 years older than you." Moody had not forgotten that. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were cut short. If you want us to keep uncovering these stories, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Carol. The case had been cold for exactly 40 years when Dennis Hargrove's daughter Melissa made a call to the Maine State Police. Melissa Hargrove was 38 years old and had been living in Portland for 12 years, a dental hygienist, largely settled, largely sure she understood who her father was. They were not particularly close. He was a distant man who communicated through action, showing up and fixing things and attending events, rather than through words. She had always assumed his silences were simply his nature. When she arrived at his hospital room in March 2024, he had been in hospice care for 6 days. He was thinner than she had ever seen him. His hands, which had always seemed large and capable, lay very still on the hospital blanket. On the second day, He began to talk. It did not come out all at once. It came in fragments, in the pauses between shallow breaths. Names she half recognized from childhood. A parking lot, a cold night, a girl who hadn't done anything wrong. He cried twice. He asked her not to stop him. He told her he had been carrying it for 40 years, that it had been like carrying a stone in his chest all that time, and that he was tired now. I buried the truth, he said. All those years. I buried the truth about that girl. Then he told her where. Melissa drove home. She did not sleep. At 6 in the morning, she sat down at her kitchen table and stayed there until the sky got light. Then she called the Maine State Police. The call was routed to Detective Sarah Moody. Moody had read the Perkins file so many times she could recite it. When the duty officer transferred the call, and Melissa began to describe what her father had told her, Moody walked out of the bullpen into the stairwell, closed the door quietly behind her, and stood very still while she listened. The location Hargrove described to his daughter was a wooded hillside above a granite quarry 7 miles outside Rockport, a parcel of land his own family had owned since 1971 and sold to a development company in 2006. The company had never broken ground. Moody submitted the warrant application that afternoon. It was approved the following morning. On March 14, 2024, a Maine State Police evidence recovery team began a ground survey of the hillside using soil disturbance detection equipment and cadaver dogs. On the third day of the search, in a shallow depression beneath 3 feet of forest floor and 40 years of fallen leaves, they found human remains. The Knox County medical examiner confirmed the identification through dental records 12 days later. Carol Ann Perkins had been there the whole time. 7 miles from Pendleton's diner. 7 miles from her father's boat in the harbor. 7 miles from the house where Raymond had waited every night with the porch light on. To the people of Rockport who had known Dennis Hargrove for 4 decades, the arrest was simply incomprehensible. He had been a selectman. He had coached their children. He had sold them plywood and paint and pipe fittings for 30 years and always remembered what you'd bought before. He had showed up to funerals and school events and community cleanup days with the reliable steadiness of someone who had decided, at some point in his life, that belonging to a place meant serving it. Nobody had ever had a reason to look at Dennis Hargrove and see anything other than what he presented. Court documents filed in the spring of 2024 showed that the physical evidence recovered at the site included skeletal remains consistent with a young female, along with articles of clothing that matched descriptions provided by Carol's family in the original 1984 investigation. A green canvas jacket and a pair of brown work boots. A DNA sample from the remains was matched to a reference profile provided by Kevin Perkins. The identification was confirmed. During the evidence recovery, investigators also re-examined Hargrove's original 1984 interview and the hardware store contractor records from that fall. What Ogilvy had never had access to, because it had been filed separately and never cross-referenced, was a complaint logged by Gretchen Waugh, a waitress at Pendleton's, 2 weeks before Carol disappeared. She had reported to Eleanor that Hargrove had followed Carol to her car after a shift and made a remark that had frightened her. Eleanor had spoken to Hargrove directly. He had apologized. Nobody had filed a formal report. One complaint, filed informally, handled quietly, forgotten. Hargrove was arrested at Maine Medical Center on April 3, 2024. Where he remained under care for his cancer. He was transported in a wheelchair. He was charged with murder in the first degree. Court records note that when investigators arrived, he was sitting up in his hospital bed and appeared to have been expecting them. His wife Janet released a single statement through the family's attorney. She had known nothing. She asked for privacy. Melissa Hargrove gave no public statement. She has not spoken to the press. On August 19, 2024, Dennis Hargrove was transported from the hospital to Knox County Superior Court in a wheelchair. He entered a guilty plea to murder in the second degree in a voice the gallery could barely hear. The judge asked him directly, had he killed Carol Ann Perkins on the night of October 26, 1984? He said yes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and remanded to the Maine Department of Corrections Medical Unit. He died there 11 weeks later, on November 4, 2024. Kevin Perkins was in the courtroom that August morning. He had driven up from Camden. He sat in the second row. When the session ended and Hargrove was wheeled out, Kevin stayed in his seat for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. Then, he stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked outside into the morning. He had been 12 years old when Carol disappeared. He was 52 years old on the day a man sat in a courtroom and confirmed what had always been true. 40 years. One word. Yes. Carol Ann Perkins was 19 years old. She drove a blue Chevette she had bought with diner tips. She brought blueberry pie home on Friday nights, wrapped in wax paper, because her brothers liked it. She was studying accounting because she had decided, with the clear-eyed practicalism of someone who had been holding a family together since she was 13, that this was a skill the world would always need, and one she could use right here, in this town, without having to leave anyone behind. On the corkboard above her dresser, which Kevin kept, there was a list on notebook paper. See Vermont in the fall. Learn to make Mom's blueberry pie. Read every book on Dad's shelf. Buy Raymond a new truck. She had not checked anything off yet. Raymond spent 31 years walking the wood lines north of town before his knees gave out. He named a boat after her and launched it in the spring, year after year. And every time he came into the harbor at the end of the day, he looked at the hills above the quarry with the expression of a man who cannot name what he is looking for. He never knew what was up there. What Dennis Hargrove carried for 40 years is worth sitting with, not because he deserves sympathy, but because it tells us something true about the nature of a buried thing. He became a good neighbor. He coached hockey. He showed up for 40 years to every obligation a community places on its members. And none of it was enough. None of it lifted the stone he described to his daughter in that hospital room. He carried Carol Ann Perkins every day. Because you cannot put down what you have done to someone. You can only carry it until you can no longer stand. It was not a database that brought Carol home. It was not a forensic breakthrough, or a new piece of technology, or a cold case unit's painstaking archival work, though Detective Moody's patience was its own kind of heroism. What brought Carol home was a dying man's conscience, and his daughter's courage to walk what she had heard directly into the hardest phone call she would ever make. What do you think it means that justice required a confession, that without it, the case might still be unsolved today? Was a guilty plea entered from a hospital wheelchair, weeks before death, enough? And how many other families are still waiting for a phone call that will only come if someone who knows the truth finally decides they are tired of carrying it? Carol Ann Perkins came home in the spring of 2024. 40 years late. But home. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe, and the links to more solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for watching.